long time actually. And he joined the Department of Wildlife and Fish as a district biologist for California, Nevada, Oregon, and Washington in 2014. Both of them obviously are scientists and they know their subjects well. And I will turn it over to them. Thank you.
Thank you. The floor is yours, Catherine. I think you're going to go first.
Yeah, I think that's what we'll do. I'll start off and then I'll shift it over to Kevin. Let me remember where all my buttons are on Zoom. Okay. Okay, can you see the screen?
You're sharing just great. Thank you.
Okay, good. I'm not totally illiterate in this technology world. So thank you for introducing us and inviting us to talk. We're both always eager to talk about turkeys. So I'll start off and then I'll shift over to Kevin, let him talk a little bit about Turkey Federation. And then we'll shift back to me briefly at the end. And we'll go from there. We'll have time for questions at the end, I believe. So just to orient folks, we're talking about the order Galliformes. So those are those birds that we think of as kind of chicken-like birds: pheasant, turkey, partridge, quail, chukar. And then within that, we have the family Phasianidae. And turkeys are in that family with pheasant and partridge. We have a subfamily, Meleagridae, and then the genus Meleagris. The wild turkey that we have here in California is Gallopavo. There is another species in the same genus, ocellated turkey. I won't be talking about that. It only occurs in Mexico, not in the US. So the wild turkey genus Meleagris originated sometime in the Miocene epoch, 5.3 to 20 million years ago. Within the Meleagris Gallopavo species, there are 6 subspecies, and they range in size from Gould's, which is the largest, down to the Mexican turkey, which is the smallest. The Mexican turkey is what the domestic turkey is derived from. We tell these turkeys apart by morphology, so largest to size, largest to smallest, and plumage characteristics as well. We can tell them apart through genetics, particularly using microsat loci. And we also can, to some extent, look at the geographic range for wild turkey. So based off of the descriptions in the Birds of North America, the eastern turkey had ranged through the eastern portion of the US, had the largest range, and the Florida turkey was really only here on the Florida Peninsula. Eastern turkeys range as far east as far west as East Texas and into the eastern part of Oklahoma and Kansas. In this area here where Rio Grande turkey occur, there's probably some hybridization that occurs. Rio Grande turkey occur through central Texas. It's possible that at some point they ranged up as far as Nebraska, and they range down to Veracruz. Merriam's wild turkey is what we kind of consider our Southwest wild turkey. My mother grew up in the Four Corners, so she calls this area here always Four Corners birds. So she would call it a Four Corners turkey. Probably nobody else calls it that. But they're found in Arizona, New Mexico, and up into Colorado. Gould's turkeys are in Mexico, range down through Sinaloa, sort of the central western portion of the state. And Mexican wild turkeys ranged sort of across that, across the part of the state that's narrow here, or a part of the country here that's narrow. We think they are very reduced in population size in their natural habitat down here. Again, this is what the domestic stock derived from. So as I mentioned before, we look at morphology as one way to tell them apart. The biggest trick is going to be the tail tips. Eastern turkeys have more reddish tail tips. The southwestern turkeys have more whitish or paler tail tips. That's subjective because, again, these birds can hybridize in those areas where the ranges meet. And humans have also created hybrids as well. But that's a layout of the 6 subspecies that of wild turkey that we have. You'll notice that I'm not mentioning anything about wild turkeys being in California. Historically, there were turkeys in California. The Meleagris genus had a species Californica. That was the California turkey. These occurred during the Pleistocene epoch. We know that they were stockier than the eastern wild turkeys, and we know about them from samples in Rancho La Brea, ranging up into Carpinteria and Santa Barbara and down into Orange County as well. This species went extinct 10 to 12,000 years ago. And the reason for the extinction isn't entirely clear, but during the Pleistocene, there were climate changes. Across North America, you had the Cordilleran ice sheet, you had glaciation, a lot of water was tied up in those glaciers. In the north, it was cold, there were frozen areas, so animals moved south to look for areas where they could feed. You had competition, and you also had predation. During those interglaciation periods, the water was no longer tied up in the glaciers, then the shoreline submerged, so any turkeys that were spending their time there along the shorelines had to move into other areas if they could. And during this time, you had extinctions, primarily the megafauna. Deer, bighorn, and other animals survived. They moved north, and they probably competed with California wild turkey to some extent. At any rate, we know that when the Europeans settled in the state in the 1500s, there were no wild turkey documented. I wanted to put up this map and just talk very briefly about concept of anthromes or anthropogenic biomes. This was a term coined by Ellis in his paper written in 2010. Essentially, we're familiar with terms like woodland and forest, but he wanted to bring in the concept of the human impact. So residential woodlands versus urban areas versus residential rangelands versus populated croplands. So in 1700, on their model, most of California was wild woodland and wild and treeless barren land. And then there were areas that were populated woodland and remote woodland. Overall, that's, in a generalistic term, fairly decent habitat for wild turkey. So the habitat was available, but the California turkeys were already extinct. So we get phone calls at the department about turkey being in people's yards, in people's neighborhoods. So it leads into, how did turkeys get into California from the east? They had a little bit of help. The first turkey introduction in recent times was in 1877, and they introduced turkeys to Santa Cruz Island. This was a private landowner. And following that, in 1908, the Department of Fish and Game introduced turkeys to the San Bernardino Mountains. Following that, which appeared to be somewhat of a success, they decided to introduce stock birds that were hybrids of Mexican and Eastern wild turkeys. They started with Yosemite area, but they really focused on the Sierra and also sort of the Western state. Sorry. In 1949 to 1950, they made an effort to introduce Merriam's wild turkey. That's this green dot right here. They made an effort to do that in Tulare County. And then throughout that period, from 1928 to 1951, they were already introducing California hybrids. So those would be hybrids of Mexican and Merriam's and domestic birds. Again, domestic birds being derived from Mexican stock. So during this time frame of 1928 to 1951, the department released 3,350 birds across 23 counties. So a pretty big effort. From this introduction, 3 populations were established in Sonoma, Santa Clara, and San Luis Obispo. The department stopped introducing pin-reared stock in 1951. The department did continue to introduce wild birds. So in other words, birds that were trapped from the wild in other states and then brought into California and released without an extensive period of time for them to get used to humans. So these orange dots with the red circles, this is Rio Grande turkey locations where they were introduced. They did their first introduction in 1959 in San Diego. These birds were popular because they're available and also because they are a little bit more adapted to the semi-arid environment that we have than the eastern turkeys. And continuing with after the introduction in San Diego, they then continued to introduce turkeys statewide, Rio Grande turkeys statewide. They continued to attempt to introduce Merriam's turkeys, primarily in areas of higher elevation, and they've had some success with that. They did continue to introduce eastern turkeys, that's these pink dots here. Those populations were not successful, but when they introduced hybrids of eastern and Rio Grande turkeys here in San Diego, and then also in other areas, they've seen some range expansion and some success in these introductions. The department did continue to do some introductions of the California hybrids, again, Mexican and Merriam's wild turkeys. The department has not done any introductions in the last 20 years. So that's a brief history of the introductions of turkeys in California and why you're seeing them in your neighborhoods or in the parks that you like to go birding in. So I'm going to shift into the components that are important for how we manage any given species, whether it's a game species or a non-game species in California. We need to understand the population trends, and we can look at a couple of different sources to do that. We need to understand the species life history. So looking at a species and looking at a year in the life of that species, wild turkey or whatever that is, and understanding when they molt, when they nest, and so forth. We need to understand and manage the species habitat needs. And particularly the wild turkey, it is a game species. So in California, hunters can get a hunting license and an upland game bird validation, and they can legally harvest turkey. So for those species like turkey that are game species, we need to understand the effects of hunting on the population. So I'll start with the population trends. The 2004 Strategic Management Plan for Wild Turkeys in California states that there are 242,000 wild turkeys in the state, and they cover approximately 18% of the state. Those are estimates. We have updated the California Wildlife Habitat Relationship Range Map. The first one was developed in 2005. We did some updates to it in 2017. We have talked within the department about doing some modeling to update this information. We haven't gotten to that point yet, but we have talked about updating this information. But this is what's in the strategic management plan. That's the current management plan for turkey in California. Currently, the department does not do any statewide survey for turkey or any other galliform in California. So one of the things that I have worked on doing extensively over the last 4 years is modeling the breeding bird survey data. The advantage that this has is that it's a large scale survey. It covers a lot of ground. And it has data on all the bird species that would be detected on that route. For anybody who is not familiar with the breeding bird survey, it's a 24.5-mile route with 50 replications. Each replication is a 3-minute point count. And the observer records all species seen and or heard. And the data is available, which makes this a really useful tool. When I go to download the data, I can then just pull out the data for California and the surrounding states. I can just pull out the species that I'm interested in out of a much larger data set. And it's freely available. The way that I use that data is a little different than just looking at the breeding bird survey page and looking at the trends that they provide. I take the data and organize into a spreadsheet, and then I map it in GIS. So here you have California. I use the breeding bird survey routes that are in California, as well as the routes in Arizona, Nevada, and Oregon. I use these bordering states to better inform what's happening here along the Colorado River in terms of populations. And of course, up here in Oregon, Klamath, Modoc, and along the Nevada side as well. I take out any routes that have 900s as the number. Those are routes that are not random. So I focus just on the random routes. And then I use a tool in GIS that lets me interpolate. In other words, if I have a point here and a point here and a point here, I can use these 3 points to model what the number of birds detected would be here, or over here, or over here. So it lets me build a model that looks sort of like this. This is an example from the modeling that I do. You see here areas where you have more than 20 or 11 to 20 birds per route, and then areas where no birds were detected on that route at all. So I built this type of map first. And then I smooth it out. Turkeys are a little bit less susceptible to this, but all of our galliform species have boom and busts, years that are good and years that are bad. And so I create 5-year rolling averages. So just as an example, using 2004, I would take the previous map that I showed, the sum of 2002 to 2006, and divide by 5. And that would give me the average for 2004. I do that for 2005, 2006, 2007, and so forth. So it's basically a 5-year rolling average. Now that I've used the information from the other states to build this model, I clip it down to just California. So I'm really focusing on the great state of California. And I have random points that I've established. I extract the values from this map to those random points. And I do this for all of the species that are upland game bird species in California. So those species that are statewide, like turkey, I use 50 random points to do this. So where I'm going with this is that this process lets me then determine trends. So across the state, you see that wild turkey were rarely, if ever, detected on surveys up until 1988. That number began to increase, mostly due to some focused efforts to introduce turkey. It increased up through 2010. Introductions stopped around 99, but the population continued to increase up through 2010. It has been decreasing a little bit. The lowest was 2017. Now, this is probably mostly due to the drought. We did see a higher value for 2018, but we'll need to continue to build those 5-year rolling averages to really get an idea of whether the population is back to its high levels or if it's stabilizing, if it's decreasing again, and what really is occurring. So I'm planning to continue to build these models each year that the data is available. So you'll notice here on the y-axis, this is number of birds per route, and this is 1. So you're probably thinking, does this really help us understand very much if there are so few turkeys detected on the routes? And certainly the routes that are carrying the higher numbers of 8 to 9 to 10 turkeys per route, it's going to be here near the Bay Area. And then also these areas here along the coast as well. It's mostly those populations that are really carrying the high numbers. Turkeys aren't detected that much on the breeding bird survey, but we can use the information to at least determine whether the trend is going up or going down or somewhat stable. So how that looks for southern coastal California is somewhat similar. Turkeys were rarely detected through the 70s, 80s, and even through the 90s. You saw an increase around about 2000. They increased up till about 2013, and now they've been decreasing. So this red line here, I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that before. The red line here denotes the last year for which I have the 5-year rolling average incorporated. So these are all 5-year rolling averages, and then 17 and 18 is the raw data because I don't have enough information to build the 5-year rolling average of those. But you're seeing an increase up through about 2013, and then the population has decreased. Again, this is probably mostly due to the drought, and we just don't really know if it's going to go back up, if it's going to stabilize, if it's going to decrease at this point. So frequently my colleague and I are asked about population explosions and if turkeys are increasing in number. And so I hope in part that the trends that I've just shown help to somewhat answer that on the statewide level, which is quite coarse, and then also to a regional level, like Southern Coastal California. But it's important to think about it partly in this perspective. So when we have these areas that are urban, and then we have a wild park like this, or a national forest, or whatever it might be, but a land here that isn't developed, we call this an urban wildland interface. And this photo was taken over the Anaheim Hills area, but this is very typical across California. I'm not singling out Anaheim in any way. This is a very typical thing to encounter. You have wildland and urban areas juxtaposed against each other. So these areas that are more wild, they can be good habitat for turkeys. So you are probably going to have more turkeys in these areas, and there's going to be more adults rearing more young. What happens as a result of that is that as the young reach adult age, they're going to want to move a little bit further away gradually and maybe come over to these other areas because they don't have to continue to compete with all the other turkeys in the areas that are more populated. So those turkeys, as they shift and expand away from an area with good habitat, they're going to expand into these areas, and these areas might be what we call a sink. In other words, you can think of it like an ecological trap, an area where they might use that habitat, but it's not the greatest spot for them. They can be killed by cars, and other problems can certainly occur. And another dynamic factor within that, defining when these birds are moving into these other areas and when they might not be, is that you have fluctuation in the source habitat. And that's going to drive how much fluctuation you might have over here, or over here, or over here. That fluctuation in the source habitat, the good habitat, is often driven by things like wildfire and drought. So I can imagine that with the bobcat fire as a particular example, that you've probably seen some wildlife in areas that you don't typically see them in because they had to move away from areas that were burned. Wildfire overall for wild areas can be a beneficial thing for wildlife, but it does have to, the habitat does have to grow back over time. So you do have birds that have moved out of those areas at least this year. So the bottom line of this is that a population of turkeys in a given area could be expanding in population size. Or you could have more birds that are being detected as people are moving into areas that are becoming developed, and birds could be expanding their range as well. So it's a dynamic situation where you have a lot of different things that can define whether a population is expanding or whether it's stable, but you're just seeing them in different areas. So I want to shift from that into the species life history. So again, sort of the life cycle, if you will, of a year for turkey. In the wintertime, so November, December, and January, you're typically going to be seeing this. Turkeys are going to be foraging together in what we call a winter foraging flock, basically. And within this, the females are going to still be tending the hatch years of that year. So the young females, particularly. As we move into January, and this is particular to what we've known for turkeys in California. I'll specify that. As we move into January, you have males that are starting to compete for females. They're starting to fluff up their tails and starting to try to look a little bit more attractive. And turkeys and other galliform species have what we call a spur. So that's this piece right here. This is the turkey foot. You have the hind claw and then 3 forward claws. And you have this spur. This occurs on male turkeys and a very, very, very small percentage of female turkeys. And the use of the spur is so that male turkeys can compete with each other. So you will occasionally see this in a turkey flock, a couple of males combating with each other, and they're trying to establish a dominance and be the one that will mate with the females in that flock. Whether or not the females are interested in the males has a lot to do with when the males start doing this and whether the females are ready to reproduce at that point. In February, the females finish tending the second year females. So those would be the ones that had been born in the previous year. Those females stay with the hen all the way through December. But about February, those females they're young birds, but they're second year birds and they're going to pair off with males. So the adult females will do the same thing. They'll start pairing off with males. In March, the hens start building the nests and incubating eggs. Clutch size can be 6 to 14 eggs. It depends on the subspecies and it will depend on other factors as well. In April, you'll start seeing female turkeys with young chicks. Chicks are precocial. In other words, they hatch out of the egg with feathers and they're able to see that first day and they're able to walk within the first day. They're probably going to stay at the nest, near the nest for the first day, but they're able to stand up and walk away from it by the end of the first day. And around April and May, the molt for the turkeys will start. A typical molt cycle for an adult turkey. Those hens that lost nests earlier in the year, they're going to re-nest by July. All of that re-nesting should be gradually wrapping up. You're going to see more adult turkeys with young that are kind of scruffy looking, but they're much more mobile. They're walking around more with their parents, moving around and feeding. And this turkey actually got up onto the wall of my apartment all by himself, even as a young turkey. So they're capable of flopping up and flying up into perches by July. In September and October, they'll finish up the molts. With turkeys, most of the feathers will molt. The beard does not molt. It's a little bit different. It grows from the base and it will wear at the tip, but it will continually grow. It won't molt and grow new feather every year like most feathers will do. And then November, the females finish tending the young males of that year, the hatch year males of that year. And then they get back into those winter flocks that are sort of a mix of second year birds, or hatch year birds. Once we get through December into January, second year birds and adult birds as well. The third part of management for species is to understand the habitat needs. So quite simply, for turkeys, the first part of habitat, shelter, they're going to be in areas where there's a semi-humid to semi-arid environment, and trees and grass are both important components of that habitat. Eastern turkeys in their natural range prefer oak, hickory, beech, and white ash. They're going to nest in forest clearings and in pastures. Rio Grande turkey typically are going to be in mesquite grasslands, especially the further south you go within Texas and down into Mexico. They'll also use live oak and pecan, elm, hackberry, and cottonwood. Merriam's wild turkeys, these birds prefer ponderosa pine, aspen, spruce, and fir. Those species tend to be a little bit higher up in elevation. Merriam's turkeys can tolerate a little bit higher elevation than the other turkeys. And they'll nest within, they'll nest in meadows within forests and also near aspen stands. Gold's wild turkey use pine, oak, and chaparral type environments, and they'll nest where there's grassy savanna. They forage on oak acorns, but also nuts. They'll grab hold of grass and sedge with their claw, and they'll just sort of run their bill along it and strip it to get the seeds that way. They'll eat shrub seeds. And they'll eat a small amount of invertebrates, grasshoppers, caterpillars, and dragonflies mostly. Those invertebrates are particularly important for developing chicks that are still young. They tend to shift into more of a vegetation diet as they become adults. And then turkeys will, when they have opportunities to do so, they will feed in agricultural crops and also in gardens. So I'm going to put up just a couple of examples of habitat. This is South Texas. This is a little bit grassier than they probably would use, and they probably look for an area with a few larger trees. But your typical sort of mesquite and other shrub grassland type of environment is what they'll use in Texas. In California, one of the areas where we know that they have some pretty good habitat, you have rolling hills, you have a shrub component, you have a tree component, and then you'll have forbs in among these shrubs, particularly in the spring. And that provides a very good type of habitat for these birds to use. And the important thing for turkeys is that they'll roost in trees. So the trees are going to be an important component for habitat for any subspecies of turkey. And you're beginning to see how that urban wildland interface is appealing to them. So if the city planners put a hike and bike trail through an area and they put trees in there or keep trees in there to keep it shaded and wooded so that people like to recreate on this trail, and they try to leave some of the natural habitat in here because it's good for California quail and California towhee and all the other songbirds that we like to listen to and see, it becomes appealing habitat for turkey as well. So they will use these areas. And pulling this back to the concept of the anthrome, we started with 1700 and populated woodlands, remote woodlands, inhabited treeless and barren lands, and then also some wildland as well. Moving to 2000, you see a shift in this model. You've got a lot of populated rangeland. You have a lot of residential irrigated cropland, primarily here in your Central Valley. You have residential woodlands and populated woodlands, so here along the Sierra. And then you have urban and mixed settlements as well. So that's why it's not uncommon for my brother to call me and say, your turkeys, since I work for the department, your turkeys are in my yard again. They will move into these areas and forage into these areas, but there's usually some wildland component nearby that they're also using. So that's a little bit about turkey habitat. And with that, I'd like to turn over to Kevin and let him talk a little bit about the National Wild Turkey Federation, particularly because we funded some habitat projects with them, and I think this would be a good segue.
Right.
Yeah, if I could interrupt briefly, I forgot to mention when we started that if you have questions, if you could put those into chat and we will collate those questions to present to the speakers at the end. I'd appreciate it. I've certainly generated a few of my own while we've been waiting, so thank you. Go ahead, Kevin.
Sure. So I'm going to keep my video off for now because I'm getting a little bit of touch and go with my internet. So I will turn it on a few times here and there to show you some things I've got in my office. But to teach a little bit about the National Wild Turkey Federation, I'm going to have to go back to kind of the history of the wild turkey in North America in general. And Katherine touched on it, but I'm going to go a little bit more in depth. So prior to European settlement, it's estimated that wild turkey populations, the North American wild turkey, were 11 million strong in the United States, Canada, and Mexico. So pretty incredible numbers. As westward expansion marched west and unregulated hunting happened, and we had a lot of habitat destruction through a lot of clear cutting of our eastern forests, we saw wild turkey populations diminish. In the 1930s, they estimated there was less than 200,000 wild turkeys in the United States, Mexico, and Canada. So from 11 million down to 200,000 in a relatively short amount of time, shows you how we almost lost this bird. Pretty crazy. So as Katherine mentioned, there were some things from the 1930s to around the year 2010 where they tried to restore the wild turkey. They made attempts at capturing wild turkey eggs, pen rearing wild turkeys, and then releasing them onto the lands. And unfortunately, that had very low success. I think she had the one stat that they had 23 releases in 23 counties, and it established 3 populations. So unfortunately, those birds just did not have the natural instincts to survive that they would have if they were born in the wild. So what agencies started doing is they started to take wild turkeys from wild populations and translocating them to areas of suitable habitat that did not have birds. So the main way that they could do that was through trapping them with rocket nets and air cannons. So the invention of those tools really helped to boost the wild turkey. So in 1973, our organization was founded. It was founded by a group of very dedicated and concerned wild turkey hunters. During that time, I think there was 1.3 million wild turkeys. So they went from 200,000 to 1.3 in the 1970s. So restoration was occurring. And we were founded under the mission statement, which is still true today, which is dedicated to the conservation of the wild turkey and the preservation of our hunting heritage. So through these partnerships between state, federal, and private organizations such as the NWTF, the wild turkey was brought back. Pretty incredible. So they were brought back utilizing funds from license sales, hunting license sales, turkey tags, turkey validation stamps, as well as an excise tax on firearms, ammunition, and hunting equipment, which is called the Pittman-Robertson Act. So those help to fund the comeback of the wild turkey. And in 2010, they estimated in U.S., Canada, and Mexico that there were around 7 million birds. So from 200,000 in 1930 to over 7 million in 2010, pretty incredible. So again, Katherine kind of talked about some of the subspecies and where they originated. You've got the blue eastern wild turkey. You've got the Osceola or the Florida wild turkey down there in southern Florida, the Rio Grande wild turkey, the Gould's wild turkey, the Merriam's. And this is kind of where they're all at today. So where they've expanded to, where they've been put, as Katherine discussed, all that stuff in the Pacific Northwest, California, Nevada, Utah, those did not originally have wild turkeys, which they do now. They've got pretty healthy populations. There actually is a population of wild turkeys and even a hunting season in all 49 states, with the exception of Alaska, because it's a pretty tough place for a wild turkey to live in Alaska. So a little bit about our organization. Since 1973, we have spent more than $425 million that has gone to conserve or enhance over 20 million acres of wildlife habitat, all in the name of the wild turkey. We talked a little bit about earlier that the restoration of the wild turkey is arguably one of the greatest conservation success stories in North America. It went from a bird that we almost lost in the 1930s to something you can look up on YouTube, chasing the mail carrier around during the springtime. So pretty incredible. We went from those two poles. We're a grassroots fundraising organization. We have membership throughout the US. We have around 200,000 members. And in 2020, we had our national convention in Nashville, where we actually had over 56,000 attendees. So a little more specifically about the National Wild Turkey Federation in California. So early on, we helped to fund and coordinate those translocations that Katherine discussed with you all. We helped to do that through fundraising from our membership from turkey hunters to help with fuel, with turkey boxes, with trapping expenses, all that stuff. And then we also contributed to establishing and maintaining our turkey hunting regulations in this state. Katherine also mentioned the 2004 Strategic Management Plan. We helped to co-author that as well. So pretty much anything that has to do with wild turkeys in California, we've tried to be a part of it and tried to do our best to make things good. So present day, in 2012, we started a 10-year initiative called Save the Habitat, Save the Hunt. And that initiative has a 3-part goal nationally. It's to conserve or enhance 4 million acres of upland wildlife habitat, create 1.5 million hunters, and open up 500,000 acres to public hunting access. So the reason that we have that 3-part goal is because we know that habitat is extremely important to wildlife species, especially in today's world where we're losing habitat, good wildlife habitat. All right, try this again. Okay, can everybody hear me? Yes, no?
I can hear you,
Maybe
Kevin.
so. Okay, sorry about that.
No,
Like I said, the internet can.
Kevin,
Right,
go.
we can hear you fine, thank you.
Okay,
just had a little dropout.
so yeah, so we had that 3-part goal to conserve 4 million acres, create 1.5 million new hunters, and open up 500,000 acres to public hunting access, because we know that we're losing wildlife habitat at an alarming rate. And one of the main reasons, one of the main funding sources for state wildlife agencies, such as California Department of Fish and Wildlife, is hunting revenue. So we want to make sure that our state agencies continue to get revenue to manage our resources. And then opening up 500,000 acres to public access, the main reason that we lose hunters is with lack of places to go. So that's why we had that 3-part goal. So in California specifically, since we started in 2012, we've helped to enhance over 13,000 acres of wildlife habitat, and we've opened up over 4,900 acres to public hunting access. So some of the projects that, here's just a snapshot of some of the projects that we've done that have helped add to that 13,000 acre accomplishment. We work a lot with the U.S. Forest Service. We have an agreement with them since 1986 called the Making Tracks program. And essentially, we enter into agreements with them to do work on their land. So we do a lot of forest thinning projects with the U.S. Forest Service. We have 2 large agreements, one on the El Dorado National Forest and one on the Sequoia in California. This top middle photo here, that's actually Katherine right there. They were out walking around in a area that we helped to thin, that the department helped to fund. And this area is just, was a fire-starved area. We've suppressed fire from our forests for so long, and they were so dense. And opening this up, you can see the lush growth of all of that on the bottom of the forest floor. We improved a bunch of open space around these oaks to be able to grow, to create acorns, which is a great food source for our wildlife. We've done a lot of native grassland restoration projects, both with the department on their lands as well as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We have done work in areas where we've helped to create water sources, such as wildlife guzzlers, in areas that are arid. And in the bottom, you'll see we've actually had projects where we've removed commercial timber, and the sale and the proceeds of that commercial timber has helped to fund some of the portions of the projects that are expensive, such as the bottom right-hand corner there, which was a bunch of handwork that we did, which is really expensive, to clear out some of the ladder fuels and create a more fire-resilient forest, which is better for our wildlife as well. Another cool thing that we've done here in the past is we've partnered with the Upper Butte Basin Wildlife Area to do a wild turkey capture and banding project. So we helped to get grant funds for this project, where we not only established a banding program, but also a hunt. So to make sure that we are having not having a negative effect on the population on the wildlife area, we're banding as many birds as we can and trying to get an abundance estimate through mark recapture. Another thing that's really cool that came as a part of that is we discovered that wild turkeys can actually pry off these butt end bands. So the typical bands that you have for birds just are aluminum butt end band, but wild turkeys have been able to pry this off. So we have put rivet bands on them as well to try and determine if they'll actually, later on when we recapture them or see them on photos and with trail cameras, whether they still have both bands or if they've been able to pry off this butt end band.
Well,
So it's kind of a cool program where we're testing the efficacy of these different types of metal bands.
question
So
presenting here.
just wanted to touch on that stuff with kind of NWTF and go over that, and I'll let Katherine kind of jump back into her portion, but just wanted to get you guys familiar with our organization, kind of what we're about, and how we've helped to do good for the wild turkey here in California. Oh, one thing I wanted to mention real quick. I'll share my video. Hopefully it doesn't lock me out. So earlier, Katherine mentioned wild turkey tails and how to be able to determine some of the different subspecies. So not only the tips of the tails, but also what we call the upper tail coverts, which are right here. And so you'll see the kind of more bronze on this bird, and this bird has more of a lighter color. So these birds are actually.
Kevin, I'm not seeing anything except a slide that's labeled hunt history.
Oh, okay. Yeah, if you.
Yeah, I think maybe you need to unshare that PowerPoint presentation and then share something else that that you have your pictures on.
Sure. Can you see me now?
There you go. That looks like you're ready to do a fan dance there.
All right. So, like we talked about earlier, so she talked about the tips of the tail feathers, but also these are the upper tail coverts right here. So you can tell how these are very bronze in this bird. This is more of a real grand subspecies. And then this bird has a little bit lighter colored, lighter at the tips, lighter upper tail coverts. So this has more of a Merriam subspecies in its genetics. So what's interesting is these birds were taken about a mile apart here in California, but we have such a hybridized zone between the areas that Merriams were translocated to and Rio Grandes were translocated to. You actually see a lot of the different genetic variations in birds in the exact same flock. So it's pretty cool. So I just wanted to share that. It's cool to look at real feathers and stuff like that. So just wanted to throw that out there. I'll turn it back over to Katherine.
Katherine, are you going to share a screen again?
I am just getting ready to click it. Okay. Okay. So can you see my screen, components of management for a
You're
species?
showing up just great.
Perfect.
Fall colors and everything.
That was my goal.
Okay.
So I'm just going to wrap up the last part of this and talk very briefly about, as we're talking about management for a species, when we talk about those game species, again, understanding the effects that hunting can have on the population. So historically, California has done harvest surveys, or what they called for a number of years game take harvest surveys. They started those in 1948, and through 2010, it was a mail-in survey. That survey through those years changed, and the ways it changed for turkey particularly are that 1968 was the first season, and in 1992 is when they split the survey into the fall and spring seasons. For turkey, that is actually a very useful thing to do. So splitting it really helped to have a better understanding of harvest when it comes to turkey. In 2014, the department decided to contract out a survey specific for upland game birds, that included turkey, to a third party to do the survey. And like I said, historically, these were mail-in surveys. That survey that they did in 2014 was a combination of phone and email. And then in 2016, we brought the survey back into the department. We did it as an online survey. And we repeated that in 2018. The reason that this is an important distinction is that how you conduct a survey, what your response rate is going to matter a lot in terms of looking at the estimates that you get from that survey. So it is important to be aware that these surveys were conducted in slightly different ways. All of these reports through 2016, 48 to 2010, 2014, 2016, all of those reports are on our website. If you go to wildlife.ca.gov, go to hunting, go to upland game birds, and then there'll be a tab for publications, and those will show up there. The 2018 report is drafted. It is not up available on the website yet. It's still being reviewed internally. That said, I can tell you a little bit about what we found from the 2018 survey. We found an estimated 15,000 hunters took 7,000 birds in the fall season. In the fall season, hunters are allowed to take 2 birds per season, and they can be male or female. The areas where hunters liked to go varied from being up here in Shasta and Tehama, and also in Sutter, El Dorado, Yolo, and then down here into the, I think that's Fresno County, if I'm remembering correctly. Where they were mostly successful was really more in the Yolo area, but also El Dorado, Placer, Shasta. So what that looks like over time, again, remember that the survey started in, the season started in 1968 and it wasn't split until 92. So here's where you have both seasons together, and then you have the fall season split off within the survey. You can see an increase in turkey harvest, and that's likely, especially in the 80s and 90s, concurrent with the introductions and the increase in the turkey population. As you get into the 90s, you do see a bit of a decrease. And then the last couple of surveys that we've done, they've been up along about the value for harvest that they were in 96. At this point, we're watching this to see if it's going to continue to decrease, and what would likely cause it to decrease would be concurrent with something that Kevin mentioned, and that's a decline in the number of hunting license sales that we have. So there's just an overall decline in the number of people hunting in California. So those harvest numbers might decline as a result of that. For the spring hunts, these are really popular with the turkey hunters. You had an estimate of 35,000 hunters taking about 22,000 birds. In the spring, hunters can take 3 birds per season. They have to be male birds. And so the popular counties were Shasta, El Dorado, Tehama, Butte, for people to hunt in. Areas where they were successful, Shasta, Tehama, Butte, and Placer. So you're seeing a little bit of similarity, a little bit of a trend there. And again, here's the survey from the 60s, oops, sorry about that, through to 92. Then you have the split where they started asking specifically about the spring season. Through all this, you see a gradual increase up to the survey that they did in 2010. Then you've seen a little bit of a decrease. That can be concurrent potentially with the reduction in sales licenses as well, as Kevin and I both mentioned before. So this is really kind of how we approach keeping an eye on what the harvest and the number of hunters look like as we're trying to manage a species. But we also look at the population. And so for turkey, again, we've had a pretty good increase up until pre the most recent drought, and then that drought probably has driven down the number of birds. So we wrap all of these things that are all dynamic: bird population, hunter population, the number of birds that hunters are harvesting, habitat changes. We try to wrap all these things together as best as we can into a management approach for wild turkey and for other species. So just in summary, there are multiple subspecies and hybrids of those subspecies that have been introduced into California. The population increased through the 2000s, but declined probably due to drought and probably due to local wildfires as well. I will add in here, the department is looking at the effects of the wildfire to the wildlife of California. We're doing it in a couple of different ways. We aren't looking specifically at the effects to wild turkey at this time, but we are looking into the effects of the wildfire and specifically to sensitive species, and looking specifically at those extremely large and aggressive fires that really were damaging to the state. So we are continuing to model and study that. We've seen an increase in harvesting trending with the increase in the population through the 2000s. The highest harvest year was 2010 for spring and 92 for the fall season. The Department of California Fish and Wildlife focuses on population trend modeling, habitat management, and cooperative efforts with the National Wild Turkey Federation to best manage wild turkey. And as Kevin mentioned, they have worked very hard to enhance and also open up acres for wild turkey habitat and provide hunting opportunity and opportunity for people to just enjoy wildlife in California. And with that, I think either Kevin or I will be happy to take any questions, and we'll probably bounce them back and forth off of each other, depending on the topic of the question.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Could I ask you, Katherine, to unshare your screen so that we can see you while you're responding to questions? And Marianne has kind of collated the questions that she's seen come in over the chat. Please add additional questions to chat if you have them. And I have a lot in case we run out.
Richard always does.
Okay.
Okay, well, from our participants this evening, DC as well as Muriel, we had questions about species competition between turkeys and other species. Do you see any impact of them on, for instance, our native species? And Muriel also asked about habitat in particular. Do turkeys have any impact on habitat?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Probably direct competition, not so much. We do get a question frequently about turkeys and pheasant. and turkeys out competing pheasant in certain areas. Really, what you have to remember in that particular situation is that turkeys like trees. They want to be able to roost in that type of environment. And the habitat that's good for pheasant is a little bit different. So really, it's a bigger issue that if you don't have a lot of pheasant in an area, it's probably that the habitat is just a little bit better for turkey and other species than it is for pheasant. Particular to other species that aren't game species, there's, again, probably not a lot of direct competition. Certainly, we look at areas that that turkeys are in, and we think about the habitat that they're using and the species of plants that are in that area. And we want to be cognizant and make sure that, you know, we aren't planning to do any introductions anytime soon, but that we follow proper CEQA and we consider what those species are that they could impact in a given area for those potential introductions. For those birds that are already here, we just do our best to best manage them as we can.
Okay.
I don't know, Kevin, if you want to add anything more to that.
Sure. Yeah. So there was a gal at UC Berkeley that did a study looking at kind of the effects of wild turkey habitat competition with California quail in Annandale State Park in Sonoma County. So it was a great study. And what she ended up determining was that, like Katherine kind of touched on, they actually occupy a different micro habitat than California quail do. As there was a lot of concern over wild turkeys in California quail, as a lot of times their habitat ranges do overlap. What she found is that they occupy different microhabitats, and there actually wasn't any disturbance effect between the two species. But there's a question we get a lot, and you do see wild turkeys, you know, a lot. They're a diurnal species, so they're during the day. They can appear to be pretty aggressive, so we do field that question quite a bit. But a lot of the research that's been done out there hasn't shown direct competition issues.
All right, great. Thank you, guys. Let's see. I was actually scanning National Audubon recently, and I was really gratified to see 2 postings in the last month leading up to our seminar tonight about wild turkeys. So I guess Audubon has the same thoughts. But they recently posted a piece about the amazing conservation work that is done to turn the turkey populations around, which was really good to see. The other piece that I saw was that there was actually, I guess, some impact of the pandemic on turkey populations in states that have more of a cultural tradition of hunting. So places like Louisiana, Georgia, Mississippi, North Carolina, and Tennessee, they've seen an uptick in hunting activity because people have more time on their hands. Do you think there's going to be anything like that we're going to see here in California?
Yeah, so that was a really big discussion within our organization too. You know, we obviously encourage people to get out there and enjoy hunting and go out there and try to put food on the table. And with the pandemic and people being out of work and working remotely, they had a lot more time on their hands. So yeah, we saw a huge increase in hunting in a lot of the southeastern states, specifically some of the Midwest as well. So yeah, there was definitely a increase in harvest in a lot of those states. So we'll see how the state fish and game agencies reply, or not reply, but react to that in the next year's regulatory cycle, if they end up, you know, reducing tags or see exactly how it works. But definitely it was a big discussion. As far as California, I could tell you there was definitely, I noticed some more people out there. We also had a little bit more of a stay-at-home order during our turkey season too.
Wow.
So that may have had kind of the opposite effect. But I'm not sure if Katherine has any numbers to look at that yet. That may be something that'll come out in the next few years.
Yeah, I think Kevin answered that extremely well. I think the only thing that I would add in is that every year, especially in the fall when the season's open for different species that are game species, we field a lot of questions about where should I go to hunt X, whether it's quail or turkey or grouse or whatever the species might be. And we've gotten a lot of questions this year where they're saying, we want to be able to go hunt this species, but the national forests are closed. And a lot of them have opened up at this point. So you have that balance that some of the other states you mentioned don't, where we did have COVID and people were either out of work or telecommuting, so they took days and went hunting, sure. But you also had areas that were closed and also areas that had been good habitat for turkey that this year are not going to be good habitat for turkey because of the fires.
Yeah.
So I really don't know what that dynamic is going to look like. What we have talked about within our program in regards to the harvest survey is potentially doing it every other year, which would make 2020 our survey year. I've spoken a little bit with my supervisor. We have not decided if we're going to do the survey this year. I think it might be interesting. I also think that there are a lot of hunters that haven't been able to hunt. So I'm not really sure if we're going to do a survey this year and actually have those numbers to look at. But I do think Kevin's point is very valid. We just have to remember too, with California, that you also had fires that drastically affected some of the good turkey hunting areas.
Okay.
Hopefully not Kevin's favorite spot, but.
Yeah, well, here, you know, we're mostly here in Southern California, and so I always have to ask the question, where can we go and look at them here in SoCal? I mean, we've seen them down in Julian, but it's hard to catch them around here and get a good look at them. You know, most of us hunt with cameras in the Audubon group, so yeah. Where would you recommend?
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, getting out and enjoying the resource any way you can, that's great. I mean, like Katherine talked about, you know, Audubon groups and a lot of the birding groups help to actively participate in conservation through like the breeding bird survey and the Christmas bird count and those types of things. So kudos to you guys. But that's where I was going to say. I mean, Southern California is tough. You know, anywhere from San Diego to, you know, Bakersfield is a rough spot for wild turkeys. I think your best bet is going to be down kind of Julian Ramona area. I know that's probably a pretty good drive for a lot of you, or going up to north, you know, onto the coast and hitting kind of that Big Sur area. I know that's a drive as well, but I think, you know, between those two sections, you should get into some wild turkeys for sure.
Okay, all right. Andy Riverola was asking, how do hunters know which birds are for hunting and which aren't? You know, when I have looked at a flock of turkeys in a tree, it looks like a bunch of umbrellas to me. How do you know which ones are male and which ones aren't? I mean, is it easy for people that know to spot it? It just seems mysterious to some of us.
Yeah, and then I'll let Kevin chime in a second. The very first thing that I will say is that when they're up in the trees roosting, you're not allowed to shoot them at that point.
Okay, okay.
So,
we can use our cameras.
yeah, you can absolutely take photos of them when they're up in the trees, but when people are hunting them, they'll be down on the ground and walking around. So that does help a lot. And then I'll let Kevin add in a little bit more as a turkey hunter as to what he keys on.
Sure. So yeah, we didn't really go over kind of what differentiates a male from a female wild turkey. So all male wild turkeys have what's called a beard. That's what Katherine pointed out when she talked about molting, how the beard does not molt. So the beard is something that sticks out of their chest, and it looks like hair, but it's actually modified feathers. And so all male wild turkeys will have a beard. About 10 to 15% of hens or female wild turkeys also have a beard. It's just a genetic trait that is still left in some of the females. They're still very, you know, they're reproductively viable and all that, but they have a beard as well. So our regulations in the springtime say you can only shoot a bearded wild turkey. So obviously that's 90% of the time is going to mean it's a male wild turkey. But just to make sure for ease of regulations, if someone shot a bearded hen wild turkey, they weren't going to get in trouble because it has a beard. It can be confusing. So that's the regulation in the fall, is they have a beard. And then also another morphological variation is males are much darker than females. They're like almost black, whereas females are kind of that buffy brown. They have a more of an iridescence to them. And their heads differ, as hens have actually feathers that come up all the way up to their heads, whereas males do not. And they have these big things on their neck called caruncles. And you'll see when they get excited, they they puff up and they strut, so they fan out the tail fan, and they fill up these caruncles with blood, and they turn different colors. This is why wild turkeys are the coolest thing. So it'll go from red to blue to white, depending on their mood, and they have this thing that hangs down. It's called a snood, and that fills up with blood too. And there's actually been some research that's shown that females will actually prefer males with a longer and larger snood, because that shows that they can put more of their energy into that, because they're more physically fit. So it shows that, through natural selection, that these are going to be the males that you want to study genetics with. So there's lots of cool stuff with wild turkeys, but the main thing is the beard is the biggest factor. And in the fall season, you can actually hunt any wild turkey. So you can hunt hens in the fall. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
Cool. Thank you, Kevin. Yeah, I knew I liked Richard's beard for a reason. Anyway, also as a follow-on to that, Andy asked, what are turkey predators? And Debbie asked that too. I mean, what hunts them? Wild dogs, coyotes, cougars, what? Obviously, man.
So yeah, so an adult wild turkey is going to be an awfully big thing for any predator like a cougar to take down. Certainly, if a young bird were to wander away from its adult, then that's probably something they might opportunistically take. But those adult wild turkeys, those are probably going to be primarily taken by hunters. And then the chicks, when they're very, very young, they're likely to be susceptible to any type of both aerial predators, things like raptors and owls. Probably not so much the owls, but occasionally if you've got a great horn flying early in the morning or just before sunset, maybe. But mostly those raptors, and also certainly I would imagine too, and Kevin can comment on this, I would imagine that if a bobcat had the opportunity to go after a young chick, it probably would. So those would be some potential predators.
Are there any state
I'll
areas for turkeys? Sorry, didn't mean to cut you off.
Do you want to add anything in on that, Kevin?
Yeah. So I was just going to say, like Katherine mentioned, an adult wild turkey is a very evasive prey bird because they have incredible vision. They can see color. It's like looking through a pair of binoculars. So they see movement and differences in color from a long ways away. They're mobile because they can fly, they can run. They're really hard to catch as a prey bird. But like Katherine was saying, as a wild turkey poult, they are very susceptible to hawks, even ravens at that age. But you mentioned owls, Katherine, and a research study that was done recently by Michael Chamberlain. He was putting a bunch of GPS backpacks on wild turkey males, and he had a pretty large percentage of those males getting picked off by great horned owls while they were roosting at night on the limb. So there may be more great horned owls that are actually taking out adult wild turkeys than you'd think, which is pretty amazing. It'd be an interesting fight to see, that's for sure.
Wow.
Yeah, I'll have to look for that article. That's interesting.
Yeah.
So that also kind of ties back maybe potentially to a question about competition with other species. Owls certainly are looking for food, but they're also kind of sensitive about their boundaries. And so if there's turkeys trying to roost in a tree that they've typically used for a lot of years, they're probably not going to be happy about it either.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So I want to amplify on a question asked by Muriel Coton. She asked if there are negative impacts on other bird species and habitat from the introduction of wild turkeys. And I guess I wanted to expand that question to, you talked about enhancing territory for the wild turkey. And I'm wondering what that means. Is it something that is a general habitat restoration, or are there specific things that are done to encourage turkeys in particular? I'm thinking of things like I've seen on your website about chufa which I think would be,
Nutgrass.
would raise horror and hackles on the back of Native Plant Society members. So yeah, I think I guess what I'm asking is how much of it is really what an Audubon member would say, yes, that's wildlife enhancement, restoration, and conservation, and how much of it is a hunting issue and you're just trying to get wild turkeys going?
No, that is a great question. So a lot of that stuff that you saw on our website, that all happens back east. Here in California, we're doing native restoration. So we work a lot actually with Audubon, a lot of those restoration projects that I had pictures of. The one that had the tractor seeding, that was seeding native vegetation along the Sacramento River. And that was a project we did right next door to an Audubon restoration where they did the same thing. We just did the same thing on a different unit, literally the same seed mix, everything. We do all native restoration stuff. When we work with the Forest Service, we are just trying to get the forest back into forest health. That's essentially trying to remove a lot of the smaller diameter conifer species that are typically, overdense or overabundant, that would not have been there with natural fire. So all of our habitat projects are, essentially enhancing native species. The one thing that isn't is putting guzzlers in the wildlife area or the wildlife drinkers in areas that there's not water. That's not typically any native restoration, but we're just trying to put water in areas where it's limited for wildlife to be able to expand their range.
Mm-hmm. So maybe Katherine would be better to answer the second half of that, which is obviously you're not just monitoring turkeys. How have these restoration efforts been in terms of restoring wildlife habitat and bird habitat specifically for the whole range of species?
That's a very good question. And I'm going to kind of target on a project that Kevin talked a little bit about because it was on one of our wildlife areas. And I'm going to go back just a little bit to the previous part of that question first. If you go to our department's website and you look for our Upland Game Bird Grant page, on there's a list of the grants that we have funded. There is a report there for one of the projects with the National Wild Turkey Federation. And if you're interested, you can look and see what the seed mix is, the different species of plants that are in the seed mix. If I remember correctly, Kevin, you had the list in the report.
Yep.
So if people are interested to see what types of plants they use for reseeding when the restoration is reseeding an area, then you can see that. Specific to that particular area, what we've also started working on is doing some short-term distance point counts. So looking at point counts for probably a period of 3 to 5 years at the most. Distance surveys take a lot of time. They take a lot of effort. So they're not the best approach for a long-term trend monitoring, but they work really well to see what the development, what the reaction is of the species to restoration area over, say, 5 years, for example. So we started doing point counts at that site. We ran into a problem that is just simply what can happen in California. That area burned pretty severely this year. And that was after we got locked down from COVID. So we're probably going to have to figure out how we're going to really survey that area, look at that spot where they did the restoration, but also look at the area as a whole and get an idea of exactly what that, how the birds are responding to that treatment in that area. I can tell you the photo that Kevin put up where we were in the forest and he was showing how they had cleared out the underbrush and left the oaks. Mountain quail were responding quite well that day. They were calling, they were vocalizing. So that leads to another part of this is that when we restore an area, and we're really looking at National Wild Turkey Federation to do this, we're talking about turkeys, but what we do for turkeys can have some benefit to quail. Quail habitat is a little bit different than turkey habitat, is a little bit different than pheasant habitat, is a little bit different than California towhee habitat, but if we work to try to benefit certain species, we can be benefiting some of the other species as well. And that's really what our goal is. And National Wild Turkey Federation's goal as well.
I just wanted to ask if you had any thoughts. I was remembering as I was listening to this marvelous documentary I saw a while back. It was by Joe Hutto, Hutto, and I don't know if you're familiar with it or not. It was put out by PBS, and it was My Life as a Turkey, and he had documented taking in some poults and raising them up and what it was like, and how the males got pretty aggressive towards the end. But it was a multi-part thing on PBS, and it was really good. So I just wondered if you guys had seen it or appreciated or had any critiques of it.
No, I haven't. I don't know if Kevin has.
Yeah, sorry, I had to drop my video here. My internet keeps killing me, but I have seen it. It's a really neat documentary, and it's been a long time since I've watched it, so I don't know if I have any critiques on it. But it always is hard, trying to anthropomorphize, birds. So it's tough to try to tell what they're thinking and put human actions to what they're doing. But it is really neat to see, and it is cool towards the end how some of those jakes started testing him and trying to take on the dominance of the flock. It was pretty cool. So that's what I remember of it. It's been a long time, so I don't really have any current critiques of it.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I'll just put the citation in the chat here if anybody is interested in it.
Yeah, it sounds interesting to me. I'll have to find it.
Okay. Well, maybe I could make a question that is more difficult to answer. So I'm sure that as part of your life working with turkeys and game birds in general, you get a comment every once in a while that either something like the California Department of Fish and Wildlife is basically state-sponsored cruelty to animals.
Yeah.
I've gotten that in response to people announcement in response to my announcement of this talk. At the other extreme, you might, there's so many regulations and fees and restrictions on the hunting itself. You must be getting reactions of, you're overrunning my rights to go out and hunt when I want to. So you've got to be dealing with that all the time. Can I get your thoughts, both of you, on how you deal with that as a public agency trying to do your job, but you've got a huge spectrum of people's attitudes about what you do?
That's a great question. And the short answer is we do our best to be as polite as possible and listen to each person's comments and concerns. In regards to introducing wildlife, really with turkeys, the push to introduce them in California had a lot to do with hunters' interests. Hunters wanted to be able to have turkeys to be able to hunt them because just like the pheasant hunters, it was something that was popular that they were interested in. And I think Kevin did a really good job of alluding to when we do an introduction in an area to restore a population. So that's a little bit different. And there has been a lot of good work that NWTF has done to restore populations too. Overall, when we talk about introductions for galliforms, and my background is really in quail, primarily as game species, quail introductions rarely are successful. And so we do have to kind of determine, is this something that's going to be good for the species? Or is it ultimately something where we're introducing birds in an area they're not going to survive and it is cruel to them? And we don't want to do that. We never want to do something that's harmful to the wildlife. And the department has heard a lot of comments and has worked very hard to develop a translocation policy that dictates that we consider all of these things that you have brought up earlier about the effects to the other wildlife, whether introducing them in an area is going to be successful. And the big part about that is if you're going to introduce them into an area, is there habitat, or has that species declined through lack of habitat? And thus just introducing more birds is going to be unsuccessful and ultimately cruel to the wildlife. We are looking at all of those different factors if we're going to do an introduction or a translocation. So we are considering those things. On the other end of it, when you talk about the hunting restrictions, Kevin probably has maybe a little bit more perspective than I do on this, but when I came into the department was after they had passed the law for using non-lead ammunition. So they were phasing it in. And so I did get some hunters talking to me about the efficacy of lead shot and things like that, and how they didn't, or a non-lead shot, and how they wanted to shoot with lead and they were angry and they were going to take their dollars and go hunt in another state. Again, you just be polite as possible when you encounter that. But overall, many hunters have found that there is value in what we can provide in California for hunting opportunity. And they have gotten used to the fact that there are potentially some more restrictions here than there are in other states, but other states have restrictions too. So it just depends on what it is that's really, that they really feel is restricting them. But we do have a person hired here in headquarters. So headquarters is Sacramento and West Sacramento. Some of us are in West Sacramento, some of us are at the Capitol or near the Capitol. Her responsibility is R3, so hunter retention, reactivation, and Kevin's gonna have to help me with the third R. Thank you. So she's looking into how we can really engage hunters again and address some of those concerns that they've had.
Yeah, so I'll just start off by saying I do not envy Katherine's job and working for the department, as there's always scrutiny, right? A good public agency, you know, you're doing the right thing when you're getting yelled at evenly from all sides. So I definitely don't envy the regulatory agency when it comes to that. But yeah, no, it's a delicate balance for sure in wanting to maintain the resource, maintain hunting opportunity. And that's something that has to be a fine line that has to be walked, you know, delicately. And in California, we have the Department of Fish and Wildlife, which is the science arm of the state. And then we have what's called the California Fish and Game Commission, which is the governing body of the state. So the commission is what sets all the rules, regulations, whereas the department is who gives them the best available science, and then the commission pairs that science with social attitude. So that's what, you know, that's where we are in California. And then also what's happened in the last several years is there have actually been hunting laws that have been passed through the state legislature. So kind of bypassing the Fish and Game Commission and the Department of Fish and Wildlife and going straight through the state legislature to pass hunting laws, which is kind of a little bit of a scary thing, because it takes all of, you know, science and the commission that was, you know, made to do this job and create or have public input and create these tough decisions. It takes them completely out of it. So there's a lot of different laws that can be put in place and regulations for hunters, and there definitely can be some confusion when it comes to all the different rules. But yeah, I missed part of the question while I was in and out of internet, so that's my perspective.
Well, you did wonderfully on the question and answers. You both did a great talk. I really appreciate all of your time and effort. And I've run you way over what the time was, but I was greedy. Thank you for obliging. I guess maybe we want to get a wrap up from Paula. She's the president of our local Audubon Society. Paula, you're going to need to unmute yourself if you're going to speak. And then thank you again and appreciate everything.
I want to thank our presenters this evening. It was a really fascinating talk. I learned more about turkeys, and I will say that I have seen a nice little group of them. I don't recall a few turkeys together. I don't remember if there was introduced a name for that, but in Morro Bay.
It's a rat. It's a
Okay.
raptor.
See there, I should have written that down. And so I have seen some wild turkeys, and I do find that fascinating. And I also want to say thank you for everyone for attending, and I do not plan on eating turkey for Thanksgiving. I wasn't before, and I'm certainly not now, but I learned a lot about, I think it's really wonderful to hear about how you're supporting the population of turkeys. I had no idea, so I want to thank you for that. I will say, please go, I'm not going to talk long. I want you to go on our website. Anybody here who has not familiar with our website, San Fernando Valley Audubon Society, check out what we're doing, what our events have been, our initiatives. And please come online for our, you'll get an invitation for our January 28th program. Our next big event next month is the annual winter, otherwise known previously as a Christmas bird count. So I want to thank you all very much, and I'll let y'all go because I know you've been hanging in there, and we really appreciate your time. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your presentation. It was very well done.
Yeah.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you
Yeah,
very
thank you
much.
very
And there is a great talk coming up in December as well.
Oh,
What is it?
Yes.
There's an international collaboration for wildlife tracking, in particular bird tracking. It's all over the world, and it's just getting going. And I have yet to find anybody who's participating in it who isn't wildly enthusiastic about it. And I've got somebody
Right.
who's going to present on that.
let's post that on our website
It
ASAP.
is. I hope it's on your website. It's going to be out in the next announcement. It should
Great.
be out in the next week or so.
Thank you. Perfect. Take care, everybody. Stay safe.
Happy
Thanks again.
Thanksgiving.
Happy Turkey Day.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Gobble, gobble.
For those of us who have seen Happy Turkeys,
Yeah.
that makes sense.
We have. I
Yeah.
want one.
Okay.
All right. Take care,
All right.
people.
Take
Good
care.
night. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay.
That was good.
Yeah. Okay. So let me see. Now we just got all the. Okay.
I've got Andy's mail. I'm going to. She really wants to talk to me like right now.
Kathy Barton must have fallen asleep. Yeah.
Hi, sweetie.